Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today, virtually as it is. I'm here to talk about climate change. I'm always talking about climate change. And yes, if you don't remember anything else I said, is it as bad as we thought? It really is worse. I was an environmental and energy lawyer for 40 years before I became the environmental commissioner, and I thought I had a pretty good sense as to how serious climate change was. And I had my socks absolutely blown off when I became commissioner and really started to study what the truth is. The essential facts, I can't see any of you, but I assume that these are things that you know. If not, it's worth memorizing. It's real, it's us, experts agree, it's bad, but there's still hope. So that's what I'm here to talk about. I mean, the short answer is that people are getting yellow fever. We're blowing away records around the world. We're blowing away records by how much we blow records away. Highest recorded temperatures, highest recorded ocean acidity year after year after year. Now, one of the things I find in Canada, most Canadians do understand that we are in the middle of a climate crisis. And most Canadians understand that it's created by people. But most Canadians don't really think it's about us. I hear, well, we're a little country, what about China, what about all those other people? Well, in fact, of the nearly 200 countries in the world, Canada is among the top 10 climate polluters, both now and cumulatively. There are only 34 million of us, but we are really, really big climate polluters. And yes, some of that is from industries like the oil sands, but some of that is also from personal habits. Who do you think drives the most climate polluting vehicles in the entire world? It's Canadians. We have beaten out every other country. So I often find that when people get bad news, their normal reaction, their frequent action is to wait for normal to come back. You hear people on the radio always talking about, gee, the weather's really weird. Well, by normal, on average, our society means the average of the 20th century. That's what our laws are designed for. That's what our culverts are designed for. Our crop species, our insurance is by and large was developed and designed for the average of the 20th century. And that's that zero line on this chart. And I hope you can tell that we don't live there anymore. And we know it can't come back because there's a lag time of decades between the time that we put climate pollution into the air, like driving a car today, and the time that we really start to experience the effects. So we've already locked in a lot more worsening of climate change. Think how much worse 2020 has been than 2010, even just in terms of climate. Well, we've got the same ahead from now to 2030, even if we get smart now, because we have locked in so much more climate pollution. Now, I often hear people talking about new normal, and we are nowhere near a new normal. New normal, to me, is you gain 10 pounds and you buy a new pair of pants. You buy a new pair of pants because you think you're going to stay at this new weight, and you'll be able to wear these pants for, I don't know, some period of time. But we are nowhere near reaching a steady state on climate. The carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which is the most common greenhouse gas, which is driving up the heat in the world, is at levels haven't been seen for millions of years, and is growing 100 times faster than at the end of the last ice age. Year after year, even during COVID, even with so many people locked down, we keep reaching record levels of CO2 in the atmosphere, which we did again in May this year. So whatever you care about, the climate crisis is a threat multiplier. If you care about hunger, the climate crisis makes it worse. If you care about war and peace, the climate crisis makes it worse. If you care about disease, climate crisis is driving the expansion of disease. If you care about inequality, the climate crisis exacerbates inequality. And if you care about nature, wild creatures are suffering heavily as we drive the climate more and more out of the bounds that it's been in for millions of years. So it's not a question anymore about if. It's a question of when, it's a question of where. Floods, droughts, wind, fire, heat, These are all photos from Ontario from the last couple of years. So how has the climate change affected you yet? I think that Andrew's now going to have a magic poll. Yes, Andrew? Okay, just give everybody a minute. Oh, you've given them 5 minutes for the poll? All right, well, I'll keep
No. I'll end it before that time. It's just a default.
Okay. Should I wait or should I keep going?
Why don't we wait just another 20 seconds and then we'll see what the results say.
Okay. As you can tell, folks, we're still experimenting and learning. COVID is definitely a learning time. Andrew, can we see the results? Maybe soon? Well, while we're waiting for the results, one of the reasons I asked this question is that, there we are. Okay, pretty good. One of the reasons I asked this question is research on climate communication, particularly in the U.S., the people like Catherine Hayhoe reports, is that most folks, even in the U.S., do understand that the climate is changing. And most people understand that it's changing because of human activity. But what's fascinating is that most people still tell pollsters that the climate crisis has not affected them yet, and they don't expect it to. I think it's still about polar bears or other people in other places where they probably can't find on the map. And they don't talk about it. And those are two of the key things that we need to change if we're going to have real action on climate. And one of the big challenges with getting people to take the climate crisis seriously is that scientists tend to talk in terms of dates that sound really far off. The big international reports are regularly talk about 2100 or 2050. Well, that's impossibly far away. I've yet to meet a politician who expects to be in power in 2050, certainly not in 2100. It just sounds too remote. But when we're talking about 2100, we're talking about the lifetime of today's children. I had a grandchild born this fall. He'll only be 29 in 2050, trying to build a family and build a career. And it's going to be much harder for him than it was for me. And he'll only be 79 in 2100. So when we're talking about what's happening this century, we're talking about what's happening in the lifetime of today's children, including those that I care about. And we've had a remarkable amount of notice. So in popular mechanics in 1911, the scientists first reported that, we keep burning all this coal, it's going to heat up the earth. So they thought it would take a few centuries. We've managed to do it much faster than that, but we've had lots of notice. And in that century, the scientists have told us and told us and told us and told us. So if anybody ever says to you they don't know who to believe about climate, there's a really easy answer. The countries of the entire world have a treaty on climate change. It's called the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, in which all the governments of the world agreed in 1992 that it was essential for us to work together to keep the heating of the world below 2 degrees, because otherwise we would put at risk all the foundations of our civilization. And the countries of the world agreed that they needed to have a reliable source of scientific information about climate as they made major decisions about what to do. And that consensus body is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, also called the IPCC. This is a consensus body approved by the diplomats of the world based on the thousands of scientists devoting thousands of hours for decades. When they say something, it's almost always understated. but we know it's based on good science. Now, the IPCC has two kinds of big jobs. First of all, they publish massive assessment reports. The last one was in 2014, the next one will be in 2022. These are enormous documents based on thousands of hours of work by thousands of scientists. And so they will tell us in 2022 how much more we have learned, how much worse things are since 2014. But they were also asked to do 3 special reports that came out in the last 2 years, and they were absolutely gut-wrenching. Let me tell you about them. So the first one was, well, how bad is 2 degrees? Remember I told you, all the countries of the world agreed a generation ago we had to stay below 2 degrees because the science that we had already in the 1980s showed us that it would be enormously bad to get past 2 degrees. But over the next 25 years, many people, and especially vulnerable countries, low-lying island states and so on, really became aware that 2 degrees is not safe. So they obtained the consent of the countries of the world to ask the IPCC to look specifically how much worse is 2 degrees than 1.5. So the Paris Agreement, again adopted by all the countries of the world, although Trump is pulling the U.S. out of it, agreed that we should be staying well below 2 degrees and if possible at 1.5. So how much worse is it? Well, the IPCC has told us a 2-degree world would be much worse than 1.5. Large, widespread, robust differences in things like heavy precipitation, extreme heat, drought, and sea level. But the biggest difference is the ability of human and natural systems to adapt. If we, together as humans, keep global heating at 1.5 degrees, we can expect virtually all human and natural systems to cope. Some definitely loss and damage, but generally to cope. If we let global heating go to 2 degrees, then the ability of human and natural systems to adapt begins to crumble unpredictably around the world. The second report was about food and land. And what's told us is the climate crisis already affects food quality and security, that we have high risks at 1.5 degrees, very high risks at 2 degrees, and if we keep delaying our action, we can expect a less stable, more expensive food supply, rapid declines in agricultural productivity, especially in tropical countries, irreversible damages to land and ecosystems, more fire, more conflict, and many more people on the move. And already, even before COVID, we can see that the number of people with acutely food secure has been climbing rapidly. The third report on the oceans and the cryosphere. The cryosphere is everything frozen in the world, ice, snow, permafrost. And what we've learned is that everything frozen is melting faster and faster and faster, much faster than was even the worst case in the assessment report in 2014. So the oceans are in crisis. Faster rising sea levels threaten coastal cities, and of course there's lots of other things along the coast, including, for example, nuclear plants. We can expect soaring flood damage, which we're already seeing around the world. We can expect dire water shortages, and we can expect hundreds of millions of people to be displaced. The World Health Organization has identified climate change as one of the biggest global health threats of this century, and they've also emphasized that whatever it costs us to get off fossil fuels, health benefits will far outweigh those costs. We've seen many examples of this around the world. Now, we know that there are already huge impacts of climate change on health, including obviously asthma of children. We also know that there are enormous impacts on natural species. So there's a whole international structure parallel to the IPCC for the living creatures with which we share this entire world. And what they've told us in their massive report last year was that there are already 1 million species at risk. The natural systems on which our lives depend are breaking down. And what else can we expect? So if you put it all together, I hope you see this is only a brief summary of why I say climate change is everything. This is the most important thing we could be working on. My whole life as a lawyer, 45 years now, everyone in a position of authority always had an armload worth of crises. They always had more to do than they could do, and so things like climate were almost always put off until we finish with the current crisis, the moment it's COVID. But there's always been a crisis. There's always been a reason for saying, we'll get to that later. And the result is that we're getting closer and closer to the window closing for the opportunity to save a stable climate. Now, we can learn a few things from COVID. This is a cartoon from The Economist, which I think gives you a taste of it, though actually climate change is much, much bigger than COVID, not just the size shown here. One of the things, though, that maybe we can learn from COVID is that exponential growth looks slow for a long time, until it isn't. It's the same thing with climate. We've had 100 years notice, and for a long time, the scientists said, it's coming, it's coming, it's coming, but ordinary people couldn't see it. Didn't want to act until they could see it with their own eyes. Well, guess what? Now we can see it with our own eyes. All you have to do is check the news, and you can see the impacts of climate change all around the world. A couple of other lessons that I hope we will take from COVID. One is that our way of life is fragile. We're unusually privileged here in Canada. There's been no war fought on this territory for more than 100 years. We've had a steadily rising standard of living for most people. We have good, safe lives, and it feels totally natural. It feels that it should always be this way, that we're entitled to it always be this way. But it's fragile. And physics, like viruses, do not compromise. People who say that we have to hold a balance between the economy and the environment have not understood. The economy is a wholly one subsidiary of the environment. We're making all kinds of assumptions that everything will continue regardless of our behavior, and it's just not so. And just like COVID, who suffers the most? It's those who are most vulnerable, often those who've done the least to create the problem. They're the true impact of climate change exacerbates inequality. And the crazy thing is, it doesn't have to be like this. There are so many benefits of reducing fossil fuels. Many of the global goals for sustainable development will be much easier if we get serious about climate. And we do have the science. I mean, again, after 100 years of work, we really know the science. The IPCC has set out for us what the numbers are. If we want a 2-degree world, remember, this is the one that the countries of the world all agreed we wanted a generation ago. It's a world that's much less stable and safe than today. It means major economic damage, but it's survivable for most people. And it means a life a lot like the life that we've had and like. If we want that, we have to be slashing our use of fossil fuels right now. Cutting them 5% a year on a declining balance sheet doesn't get us there. We have to have a quarter of our emissions gone in the next 9 years. That's during the working lifetime, probably of your car and your boiler and many other things that we already own. And if we want a 1.5-degree world, and remember, it's less stable and safer today, but it's manageable. It means that natural and human systems are likely to be able to adapt. If we want that, if we want young people today to have a chance at a world that has a stable climate, is a lot like the world I grew up in, then we have to be cutting today's emissions in half this decade. That's basically 9 years left. And we have to be to net zero in 30 years. It sounds like a long time, but absolutely isn't. So how close are we to 1.5 degrees already? I want you to watch and see how much of the space for 1.5 degrees has been used up in your lifetime. Watch it one more time. We're almost there. So we're in for big changes. No matter what we do now, we're in for big changes, but there's still a little time to avoid the worst, and our choices right now really matter. So we do know what to do. We know basic recipe is really simple. We have to reduce carbon pollution. We've got to support carbon sinks, it seems like wetlands and forests and mangroves. We have to improve society, reduce inequality, bring everyone along, so that we can hold together under the hammer blows of climate change and make the changes that we want. And we know it's not going to be easy, but it is going to be worth it. We know that collective action matters the most. Individual action is powerfully directed by infrastructure and policy and tax laws, and collective problems need collective action. That's what government was invented for. And as I reported to the legislature, there's only 3 big things governments can do to deal with crises as large as the climate crisis. Making polluters pay, things like a carbon price. Investing in solutions, which Ontario was doing until the Ford government was elected, and regulating polluters. Those are the only big things we've got. And we know which policies work. And for those of you who are interested in the climate crisis, and I know that Professor Wickham is going to be doing this in some of his classes, go look at Climate Interactive and try yourself. Play with the different policy tools that governments have and see which ones work. You can see on the right-hand side, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but the 1.5 degree, oops, hang on, I've lost it here. 1.5 degree line is here. You can see we're almost there. At the rate we're going to blow past that in just the next few years. And then the 2 degree line isn't much farther behind. So go to the Climate Interactive website and try it and see yourself what policy tools would be necessary if we want a stable climate. If you want a stable climate, what policy tools do you need to be asking government to adopt? How do we get collective action? Well, here's 11 more words I'd like you to memorize. Please say them back with me, everybody. Simple, clear messages, repeated often by a variety of trusted voices. This is the best recipe for how to reach other people, how to get change. And who's a trusted voice? Well, you'll be a trusted voice for some people. Maybe you can support someone who's a trusted voice for other people. The most trusted profession in the whole world apparently is nurses. Do you know a nurse? Can you support them to speak up about this? But also medical professionals, religious leaders, people who are trusted in their communities. We need to hear from them about the importance of climate action. And we need to take action with others, for sure. One thing we know absolutely is that action feels better than anxiety. And most people feel sort of helpless and alone. It feels so much better to be taking action with others that can't be in the streets in the same way right now, but there's still opportunities to speak up. And here's 3 really important things in Ontario to speak up about: pricing climate pollution, stopping sprawl, and protecting nature. So who have you spoken with about climate in the last month? And we're going to take 30 seconds, Andrew?
Yeah, this is a short answer, so maybe we'll take a little bit longer, but I'll close the poll in a little bit, and then I think there's about 20 seconds or so that it gives for people to get their final thoughts. So make sure your thoughts are in. I see a lot of people are currently writing, which is good. So I'll give about 20 more seconds here. There we go. There. Did it show up?
I see questions but no answers. Oh well. Okay, don't worry about it. We'll keep going. But
I'll make a new poll shortly with some quick little answers, and then you can continue on, okay?
All right, we'll try. WebEx is not my favorite tool, but it's the tool we've got, and so we're working in any event. So collective action is the most important, but individual action definitely matters too. It matters for what you do at home, and it matters what you do at work. The very last report that I got out of my office the day before my office was abolished by the Ford government was this one, Climate Pollution Reducing Life Footprint, setting out the data for the individual carbon footprints of the average Ontarian. And what we found is that in terms of direct footprint, for the average Ontarian, half of the impact came from just 4 things. Driving, remember we drive on average the worst, most climate polluting vehicles in the entire world. Second, heating leaky homes. We have a lot of older homes that were built assuming that energy was cheap and using it didn't matter very much. Flying, which admittedly we don't do quite as much at the moment, and eating beef. Those 4 account for the average climate pollution of, half of the climate pollution of the average Ontarian. Another way to think about it is with this acronym on the left, transport, housing, investment, nutrition, and consumption. Investment's important because we didn't cover that in my backgrounder, but we know that banks, pension funds, even insurance companies, they make a huge amount of impact to our climate pollution in terms of who they invest in. Do they invest in clean energy and energy efficiency, or are they investing in carbon-heavy industries? And the Canadian banks are some of the worst in the world in terms of funding fossil fuels. So, which is why I, for example, am moving my banking out of the major banks into a co-op. We know that climate change can't be left entirely up to government, especially when we have a government such as the one we have in the moment in Ontario that had destroyed almost all the climate actions of the previous government and is not doing anything of its own, or very little. Okay, so the new poll's up again. Did you want us to? Okay, let's try the poll one more time.
That's right, yeah. We're just waiting for a bit, and you can continue on for a little bit. I'm going to close the poll.
All right, it's more than one answer, right?
That's right. You can select as many as you want. So you have 20 more seconds or 15 at this point, and you'll be good.
Okay. Well, mine closed, but that's okay. But what about what we do at work? People are still polling. Okay, well, looks like lots of people have spoken to someone. Thank you very much for that. Great. Whatever you did last month, you should do more next month because we know we need to keep up and amplify the conversation on the climate. But good, thank you. But what can we do at work? So I spend an awful lot of my time giving people really bad news about climate. And when I started talking about climate, that's what people needed the most, was to be shaken out of their complacency. Now I find that an awful lot of people are already frightened about climate. What they need now is not to be frightened more. What they need now is a sense of, well, what can we do about it? Where is there a place for me in finding solutions? And so combining that with the COVID shutdown, which canceled all my speaking tours around Canada talking about climate, I started a podcast. So this podcast is called Green Economy Heroes. And what I'm doing is I'm interviewing green business leaders across Canada. And I worried a bit at the beginning that I'd run out of people to talk to pretty quickly. And I've been delighted to find out how many different kinds of folks are starting and running and working in businesses that reduce our carbon footprint right across Canada. All ages, different genders, backgrounds, locations, big businesses, small businesses, all kinds of ideas, some of them that I was really familiar with, some that I had never even thought of. I mean, the one that really struck out at me as the biggest one outside my imagination zone was a company called Pond Technologies that they do carbon capture. Well, I mean, I've heard a lot about carbon capture. Basically, it doesn't make any economic sense. It costs way too much. Much, much cheaper to stop putting carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than to try to get it back. So what do? They capture carbon dioxide, they feed it to algae, and they make fancy high-end health food stuff, which they can sell. They only get 4 cents a kilo from the carbon capture side, but they get $10 a kilo from selling their products in health food stores, and that way they can make carbon capture work, and they make a really good supplement, which is making my dog feel better. So there you go. So here's a bit of a word cloud that I made of some of the things that people are working on that I've interviewed them. I'd encourage you to go to wherever you get your podcasts and check out Green Economy Heroes, or you can find them on my website, saxe.com. But the point of this is there's lots of ways to be an entrepreneur or a green business leader in ways that reduce Canada's carbon footprint and help with other things, including Indigenous reconciliation. So the question is, what's your vision? Do you have an idea for a business that you can start or run or help run or work for that will reduce our carbon footprint? Because it's urgent and there's so many opportunities. So here we are, one last poll. Hopefully this one will go better.
So I think actually the best way to do it for this one would be if you see in Q&A there, people can type their answers, and then in real time we can see what everyone's responses are. The other really fantastic thing about this is that right after this, our Seneca students are going to be heading over to our workshop, and we're going to be exactly dealing with this issue. So that would be a really great thing to find out. So if you want to go to Q&A here and then just type if you do have a business idea, or if you do have any thoughts or ideas, you can write them in the Q&A there. So we have one about agriculture. Do you see this, Diane?
I'm not yet. I'm just trying to find it.
It should be, I
think. I got it. Thank you.
Yeah, bottom right, and then Q&A, I think.
Depleting plastic. Okay. Lots of ideas about agriculture, which is great. Enormous opportunities in agriculture. Waste management, garden planning, use more bamboo. Okay. Food recycling, sharing, eco-friendly retail, green concrete, remediation of contaminated sites with microbes. Okay, more bamboo, building construction material, reduce overloading. Well, anyway, so there's lots of ideas. That's great. I'm excited to see how many of you have got ideas for making the world a better place. Because this is what I've learned. Who would like to have some hope here? Well, I would. The only formula I know for hope is this one. You have to start with knowledge, and you folks are going to get that knowledge, whatever you don't have now. That's one of the reasons to get a degree like this. But knowledge alone isn't enough. If you just sit with the knowledge of how bad things are, it's a recipe for despair. What we need is to combine knowledge with action, and especially action with other people. It's knowledge plus action that gives us hope. Nobody can do everything, but everyone can do something. And a lot of you, I think, are going to be helped building the green economy heroes of the future. So thank you very much.
Excellent, thank you. I'll just get Bill here. All right, you're on the
There I am. So Diane, what we'd like to do now is to allow our students the opportunity to provide questions, comment, to observe as well. So we'll give a bit of time for people to post their questions. Why don't I start with a couple of questions to you? Do you have any hope that the climate change challenge can ever be depoliticized, or is that just something we're going to have to live with over the next period of time?
Well, it clearly should be depoliticized. When a whole group of people are in a small lifeboat in the ocean and their life is at risk, to be having a political fight is craziness. We all should at least have a common interest in human survival. And we're at the stage, I mean, as the Special Rapporteur to the United Nations Human Rights Council put it, we've now reached the stage that this century, that means within the life of today's children, our best case is widespread death and suffering, and the worst case is humanity on the brink of extinction. Mm-hmm. So that ought to motivate people to work together. It certainly is true that we have a poisonous amount of partisanship on climate change and many other science things, much, much more than there was when I was young. And the astonishing change in the last 50 years in approach to science, in approach to partisanship, in valuing common interests, really parallels the increasing inequality in status, and it also parallels a very deliberate campaign launched and financed by the fossil fuel industries to cast doubt on science and to get political decisions that favor that industry. So I think it'll be hard to get past the politicization, but I don't think it's impossible. We've seen cultural change before in ways that seemed unimaginable. And there is a concentrated amount of effort now at reducing the political and economic power of fossil fuel companies, which is starting to bear fruit. We see this divestment campaign, which is growing, and I don't know what. Every educational institution should have a divestment campaign and a plan for reducing its fossil fuel footprint. And I don't know whether yours does or not, but if the combination of divestment and people choosing other alternatives and the concentrated attention to the misdeeds of the fossil fuel companies is reducing their political and economic power. We see Exxon out of the top rank of the S&P for the first time since the index was created. We see that over the last decade or several decades, investing in fossil fuels has been going to lose money and not make it. That could turn off, well, at least turn down, the money pump, which has been, I think, responsible for part of the division and the partisanship. But we absolutely need to keep going. And this is, again, an area where students are really important, young people, tremendously important, to be putting pressure on their banks and their pension funds and their educational institutions to change how they invest. That can make a big difference.
It was John Maynard Keynes, who the noted economist, who once said, in the long run, the problem with issues is in the long run, we're all dead. It really seems to me that one of the important First Nations maxims of 7 generations is one way of addressing those particular perspectives in the sense of legacy. And you did talk about your own grandchildren and how how they will be impacted by these issues. Are there other messages and stories and ways of acting that will engage people across the generations?
I think that artists have a tremendous role. I mean, I'm a lawyer. I trade in logic and facts and precedents and all sorts of useful things that generally people do not love. Mm-hmm. If you think about, who inspires you, it's almost never a lawyer. But what about a singer or a poet poet or other people that people really admire and are inspired by. And so I think that cultural institutions and artists can do a lot. When I was young, it was people like Dylan, that we could march down the street singing a song. Well, where are the really great climate protest songs? You see protests still singing the songs I sang when I was young. That's not a good sign. Right? So I'm very excited about the Royal Ontario Museum. So that's a project I've worked on for a whole year. So they are now hiring their first curator of climate change and getting involved in climate change programming, which is very exciting. So cultural institutions and artists, I think, are worth a lot of attention. The other thing is financial institutions. So Bill McKibben, one of the founders of 350.org and one of the best climate thinkers around, wrote a wonderful article last year called "Money is the Oxygen That Fuels the Fire of Global Warming" in the New Yorker in September 2019. I strongly recommend it. And his point was that what we need to do now is focus on putting pressure on financial institutions, because they're the money pump to the fossil fuel companies, and they have been allowed to get away with it, making all the money and taking none of the blame, and they are vulnerable to public pressure. So that's paying attention to financial institutions, pension funds, really good, important way to make change right now.
So we need a Bob Dylan for the climate change movement, I guess, would be one place to start. I have more, but Andrew, I'm not seeing any Q&A coming up here as yet. Are there questions?
So, there's lots of questions here. So it's probably on the bottom panel, the Q&A panel. So I don't know if you can scroll through, Dianne, and you want to see. And then Bill, in the bottom right, you should be able to click the three dots and then open up the Q&A panel if it's not there already.
Okay.
And then there's lots about
Why don't you pick a question? Because there's so many.
Yeah,
yes, exactly. All right. So from your experience in the government, what are some alternative policy tools besides the existing carbon tax, or is that the best option for governments?
Ryan, right after Ontario scrapped our cap and trade system, William Nordhaus won the Nobel Prize for Economics for proving that a price on carbon, whether the carbon tax or cap and trade, is the best single tool that the world has for dealing with climate change. It's not enough by itself, for sure. The carbon tax that the federal government has in Canada, it's a very low carbon tax. There's a number of problems with it. But as far as I'm concerned, we have to have a price on carbon. And now what we need to do is improve that price, not get rid of it. It's definitely got holes. It needs to be higher. It needs to rise steadily, and we need to fix the holes. But we have to have it. However, we need to have many other things. As I said, the three basic group of tools for governments that work is, first of all, to price pollution. Pollution shouldn't be free. When it's free, you get more of it. The second is to invest in solutions, and generally that's another reason that you need a carbon price. I mean, the cap and trade system we had in Ontario produced nearly $2 billion a year, all of which was going back into investment in solutions that would reduce carbon pollution, mostly going to municipalities, universities, schools, hospitals, transit. And the third thing is regulation. There are some things you have to do with regulation, like closing the coal plants in Ontario was done by regulation. Very, very important to reduce climate pollution, but equally important or more important to reduce air pollution. There's nearly 1 million people with asthma in Ontario, and my husband was one of them. And we had 53 smog days a year in Ontario in the mid-2000s. Those days were brutally hard for him. That went to zero as soon as we closed all our coal plants.
Great. So this is kind of like, I'm kind of mixing two questions together here a little bit, but I guess what industry or industries you think are the biggest contributors to climate change? And then with that, how can we express and urge those companies to change their policies?
Well, in Canada, the biggest sources of climate pollution are the oil and gas producers, so the oil sands in particular. But in Ontario, the largest driver of climate pollution is urban sprawl. The endless building of subdivisions force people to drive long distances. The Greater Toronto Area has the worst commuting in North America, worse than Los Angeles, worse than New York, and that's because of the way land use is done. What can we do? First of all, we all have the power of consumers. If we don't buy their products, they don't make as much money. We have power, when you're a saver with power as investors, your parents may be, or maybe you are paying into a pension plan, maybe you know someone who's receiving money from a pension plan. The Canada pension plan, which we all have to pay into once you're employed, is one of the worst in Canada. It's got a terrible carbon footprint, 3 times as bad as the Canadian depot. So anyone who pays into the Canada pension plan has a right to be writing and asking them, well, what are you doing to reduce your carbon footprint? Why is it so terrible? Why are you continuing to buy coal assets and pour money into expanding fossil fuel production? So the power of consumption, the power of ownership, the power of exhortation and speaking up, and the power of asking for government action. There's also, of course, the power that I mentioned earlier of just disrupting them. If you can come up with something better so that people don't need whatever it is that they sell, that can also provide a way forward.
Great. Since you've had experience sort of in this, when changing the party in power, how much time is spent undoing the work of the previous government, good or bad? And unfortunately, this was the case with the progress in the environmental sector. And so the kind of question is, how do we transfer power without undoing any progress that might have made before? What's the best way?
Yeah, that's a really very, very hard question in a parliamentary democracy. I spent a chapter on that in my last climate report, which is available on my website because the government broke the links to them all. Basically, we have the only way we have to limit the power of an elected government is either with something constitutional. So the David Suzuki Foundation has been pushing the Blue Dot campaign of adding a constitutional right to healthy environment in the Constitution, which is enforced to some extent by the courts. There is also the approach taken in some other countries. So the parliamentary democracies that have done this the best are the UK and the Nordic countries. The UK did it. I guess they got lucky in a way that Lord Stern put out a devastating report in 2006 on how enormous the damages were going to be from climate change. And the very next year, the UK had a £3 billion set of floods. Just destruction of civil infrastructure since the Second World War, hundreds of thousands of people without power, thousands of people out of their homes, like this massive visible destruction that everybody could see and relate to. And right after that, with bipartisan support, they passed a climate act that is really brilliantly designed to deal with this problem because the climate budget is set 12 years ahead. So today's politicians don't have to face the voters because the pain doesn't happen until 12 years later, and the later politicians can blame the ones before. So it helps a little bit smooth out some of the problem with short-term decisions. The other approach is taken by the Nordic countries is that to look at the personal responsibility of everybody in power. So their approach was anyone, any elected representative, a parliamentarian at any level, now that we have the Paris Agreement, now that we can see the climate index, is personally responsible for climate action. And they support each other in that approach, and it's a moral assertion as much as anything else. If you are in power, this is your responsibility. people alive today are suffering. Our children are starting to suffer more. What are you personally doing about that? And I started a project like that, but then of course it got trashed when my office was abolished by the Ford government.
No, exactly. I see a couple concerns, and I hear this pretty vocally as well, is that typically when people talk about remedies to climate change or solutions like a carbon tax, that it puts the pressure on, the price of goods, all this goes up, and the people have to sort of pay for this on a bottom level, and you're actually hurting a lot of people in poverty or on that level. What things are being done so that this doesn't happen, and maybe what's more of the reality of this of these solutions, other than maybe the way sometimes people view them?
Well, thank you. That's an important question, and one that we spend a lot of time looking at. The short answer is that the people who use the most fossil fuels generally are the richest. It's not the poor people. So I looked at, for example, the cap and trade system in Ontario, because that was what was in effect when I was commissioner. Most of the time I was in commissioner. And I mentioned that the carbon tax the cap and trade system brought in about $2 billion a year. So I calculated that for 13% of that, the net cost to the poorest 40% of the population could be completely reimbursed. And I recommend that we should be doing that. But it's not just the immediate out-of-pocket cost. It's very often the people in lower incomes live in worse housing. So social housing is particularly notable in Ontario. It was built cheaply, as if the cost of energy wouldn't matter, and then they're very expensive to heat and cool, and they're unpleasant to occupy. They're cold in the winter and they're hot in the summer. So we can just put up the price of fuel and leave people paying more to be uncomfortable, or we can reinvest some of the money in making those buildings efficient. And so that was what was happening under cap and trade, is that a lot of that money was going to improve low-income housing, which makes them healthier to live in, cooler in the summer, warmer in the winter, and much less expensive to operate. So for the tenants, the cost of living went down, the quality of life went up, and the carbon footprint went down at the same time. Same kind of thing comes with city infrastructure. When cities are designed to benefit only people with private cars, then everybody suffers, and quite often the health price of the dirty pollution from those cars is mostly paid by poorer people. When we provide better public transit, especially clean buses, as well as safe ways to get around that are free, like bicycling, well, that helps reduce the cost of living for the most vulnerable and improve their health, improve the air quality, and improve the general quality of life for everybody. So we do have to pay attention to equality, but the assumption that we have to choose between one or the other is just wrong.
Great. All right, and then the final sort of question before we kind of get into wrapping things up is, where can people find your podcast?
Well, thank you for asking that. It's on my website. If you go to my website, saxe.com, and let me see if I can figure out how to answer that. There you go. You can also just look up Climate Podcast, and you can go anywhere you get podcasts, whether Apple or wherever else, and look for Green Economy Heroes. You'll find it there. On my webpage, you can see a whole list of each of the episodes. You can listen to a 1-minute clip if you want to get a sense of what it sounds like and see a picture of the person I'm interviewing. And if you've got a suggestion, if you know someone who's built a green business that's reducing our carbon footprint, and especially I'm interested in people from diverse backgrounds and different parts of the country, let me know.